Hi, my name is Paulina Kewes. I'm a tutor in English at Jesus and professor of English literature. And I'm stuck at home like the rest of you. I hope you and your families are well.
Hello, I'm Sue Doran. I'm Senior Research Fellow in History at Jesus and Professor of Early Modern British History. I also am stuck at home, but rather enjoying it as I can get on with work. I hope you are all well.
So could you tell us what it was like living through the plague under Elizabeth and James?
Well, in the first place, it wasn't such an unusual occurrence. Plague came in bouts, and so it wasn't like our present day COVID virus. It is something that people expected and were used to dealing with to a certain extent. It was particularly harsh living through plague in London, where there were far more deaths. So in 1593, for example, there were 10,000 who died in that year alone, and even more died in 1603. The rich could leave London, and they did in droves, and they went to their country estates or to friends' houses. The monarch tended to be shut up either in Hampton Court or Richmond, might spend some time in Whitehall, but certainly wouldn't go into the city. For those people who were left in London, there were plague regulations, couldn't communicate with each other, so things are not entirely new. They were expected to put signs on their houses, on their doors, when the plague had reached. There were shortages of food, and it was a really uncomfortable living, especially as the bodies started to stack up and had to be sent down the river in order to be buried outside the city. Paulina, what was it like in 1603? I mean, it was a pretty strange time.
Yes, the plague, so far as we know, it actually started on the continent in Lisbon in 1599. And by the beginning of the 17th century, cases started arriving in England. So it really starts in England in 1602 and lasts into 1604. It was a strange time because, of course, it marked the transition from Elizabeth to James. Elizabeth dies in March 1603, and James VI of Scotland, a steward, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, accedes to the English throne without a problem. There is no civil war, there is no rebellion. And this defies all the fears and anxieties with which the Elizabethans had been living for so long. So for many preachers, poets, and ordinary people, this is a sign of providential care of England. God has ordained that there will not be any war, and James is the providential rescuer. And of course, when he travels south, and, as it were, seems to be bringing more of a plague to England, those kinds of assumptions are thrown out of the water. And even the very sumptuous royal entry into London that should have preceded his coronation had to be cancelled, or rather postponed, for a year. But James was very keen that the coronation should go as planned.
It's worth noting that the plague was worse in the summer rather than the winter, and it really struck London in 1603 and again in 1592 and 1593 around July, and would last until, well, in some cases it could go right the way through to November, December, when you get the waning of the death rate. So it's very much because of the heat, because people are perhaps outside more and in contact with each other more. It's the summer that's the worst months, for the plague.
Yes, but although, of course, the plague was a horrible thing for the wider population, and as you said, the rich usually could escape, and the pestilence was some of the worst in the city, as it is in the city of London, as it is now. For some people, such as Shakespeare, it actually, the plague times turned out to be a very productive period. In 1593, Shakespeare wrote his narrative poems, Venus and Adonis, The Rape of Lucrece, when the theaters were closed. And again, the theaters were closed in 1603, 04, and again in 1606 into 7, because it was feared that huge gatherings of people in playhouses might actually spread the contagion.
Actors and part of the theatre companies would tour outside London when the plague was on. But in 1593, Shakespeare decided that this gave him the opportunity, as Paulina said, to write. And two major poems came out, two major epic poems, The Rape of Lucretia and Venus and Adonis. Both of them he found publishers for. One of the publishers was his friend from Stratford, so he knew that this would not just be stuck in a drawer. And he built himself up a reputation as a poet from these two works.
Famously, Shakespeare didn't take as great a care over the publication of his plays as, for instance, his contemporary Ben Jonson, but he did take care over the publication of his poems, and he even equipped them with a dedication. We know about the dedication of Venus and Adonis to his patron, the Earl of Southampton.
Well, the Earl of Southampton, Henry Wriothesley, was a man most interested in the arts, but he was also a soldier, and he fought with the Earl of Essex, and later on in 1601 he was caught up in the Essex Rebellion and put in the Tower. And one of the first things James I did when he came down to, well, even before he came down to London, actually, when he heard of the Queen's death, was that he ordered the release of Southampton and one of his colleagues who'd also been involved in the revolt or rising, so that they were freed as a gesture of goodwill, and also because of James's good relationship that it had with the Earl of Essex before the Earl of Essex decided to take to the streets of London in 1601. How did literature respond to the plague, both in 1593 and in 1603?
One of the striking things about the literary response to the plague is that there was very little of it. And by this I mean imaginative literature, whereas early modern plays stage all kinds of atrocities. People are beheaded, women are raped. We don't actually ever see people dying of the plague or a city affected by the plague in the drama. What we do see of are a lot of sermons that obviously talk about the plague, as well as the so-called plague pamphlets. What the preachers did when they gave sermons across the country, and when those sermons were later published, was to blame the onset of the plague on the corruption of the moral contagion among the population. So the advice was that you should amend your ways, that you should better yourselves. Otherwise, God's wrath would not be appeased. And the plague pamphlets, there were basically pamphlets such as, for instance, the one by Thomas Dekker, which was printed in 1603. It was called The Wonderful Year. The pamphlet describes the death of Elizabeth and the accession of James, but locates it in a wider context of the pestilence. But if we go back to imaginative writings, although they never depict people dying of the plague, being infected, they are often full of references to the plague in the language. And of course, the famous one, a plague on both your houses, but there are many more of those. And I could say a little bit about that in Hamlet. Now, in contemporary medical discourses about the plague was often linked with venom, with poison. And of course, in Hamlet, we see widespread pervasiveness of the language of poison, both because old Hamlet was poisoned and because, as it were, the ghost poisons the ear of Hamlet with his tale. So what we see in the court of Denmark in Hamlet is this prevalence of the imagery and language of disease, of corruption, of contagion. And what is quite striking is that that kind of language is more prevalent in the longest version of the play, which gets published in 1604. And it has been suggested that perhaps Shakespeare revised and expanded Hamlet after the onset of the plague of 1602-3, and perhaps it was the impact of that disease that accounts for the greater proliferation of such language in the second quarter of Hamlet.
It's also true that the plague was a metaphor in political writings and correspondence as well. And this is particularly true in 1603, because although, as Paulina has already said, James's peaceful accession to the throne was seen as providential, that God was working in this wonderfully mysterious way that saved England from civil war. At the same time, being followed immediately by the plague, there was a sense of dread and the use of the plague to talk about some of the political events that rather frightened and alarmed people both in power and people with access to power. So, for example, the projected union between England and Scotland was seen as a plague. And of course, the use of the word plague was familiar to people in referring to their political opponents. And so the Puritans were seen as a plague, the Catholics were seen as a plague. So this whole metaphor of the plague really had strong resonances, particularly in those years where the plague was rampant or where the plague had just passed.
You mentioned earlier that the rich were better able to protect themselves from the plague, plus à charge, because they were able to retire to their country estates. And what's quite interesting again about 1603 and King James's arrival in England is that as the court moved around, it could be seen to be bringing the plague in its wake. And that in turn might suggest to the people that it was the Scottish plague, that it was the Scottish king whose accession had been hailed as providential, is actually spreading the disease across his new kingdom.
Yes, that's very true. But it also has to be remembered that Elizabeth too went on progress during the plague months, because as I've said, the plague was prevalent in the summer months, and they were the months that the monarch went on royal progress. And Elizabeth, for example, in 1593, went on a progress, admittedly a shorter one than she would normally do, to Oxford and passed on places on the way. And again, as you've mentioned, James stays at various places. He really holds up in the Earl of Pembroke's place at Wilton for quite a while during the plague years, during the plague of 1603. And yes, it's absolutely true. There's both a sense of him bringing the plague with him, but also escaping the plague, which would not have escaped the notice of those people who were hearing or reading about what was happening to the court during those months.
If we think about the experience of living in London during the plague years, obviously the houses of those who had been infected were boarded up. There was often a curfew. People who were attending to the sick were marked so that people could give them a wide berth. But something that's really worth remembering is the audibility of the plague, because when funerals were taking place, the bells were ringing, and depending on the parish, I mean, if there were a number of deaths and funerals in a given parish, then it meant that those bells were ringing and ringing and ringing. And this is something that Shakespeare alludes to in Macbeth, one of his early Jacobean plays. Imagine, I mean, one of the eerie things for us now is how quiet everything is, whereas for them, hundreds of years later, it was the bell tolling which really marked that experience. Could you say a little bit about the plague of 1606-7?
Well, again, the plague came in the summer months. In 1606, the plague was strong in the summer. Yes, the theatres were closed, but there was a royal visit that took place in that year, which was the brother of Queen Anna, who was Christian of Denmark, King Christian of Denmark. And he was very disappointed during his visit that he couldn't spend time looking at the sights of London. He was kept out of London for most of his visit. I think he spent one day there, and they sort of quickly hurried him in. He saw the Mint in the Tower, and then he was hurried out again. And he was forced to go hunting, much to his displeasure, at great lengths with James. He didn't enjoy hunting quite as much as the English king. So it was a time which could be very difficult to manage for the court. On the one hand, they wanted to continue with their activities and with visitors coming, but on the other hand, they knew it proved dangerous, and they had to curtail some of the entertainments. One other point that I want to make is that we mustn't just think of the plague as being a London event. In 1603, considerable numbers, high proportion of the population died in a couple of towns in the northwest of England. Some 5,000 people died in what is now sort of close to, Cumberland. It was then Cumbria now, near the Lake District. So this was not something that was only experienced in London. It affected other parts of the country as well, but obviously less virulently.
Shakespeare writes King Lear during that plague time, which you've just mentioned. Of course, in that time, when theatres remain closed, the acting companies are not performing, or at least they are not performing for public audiences. We do know that sometimes when the theatres in London were closed, there were some performances at court, and occasionally the acting companies traveled. So when the London playhouses are closed in 1606-7, Shakespeare writes King Lear. And again, that's a play which doesn't in any way dramatize the events of the plague. But when Lear curses his daughters and he refers to the plague, this one line would have been extremely poignant for the audiences. Now, we sometimes assume that today that anyone who had contracted the plague died of it. And that is not quite true. There were some lucky few who survived. And one of them was Simon Forman, an early modern sort of doctor, and someone whose notes preserve information for us about some early productions of Shakespeare's plays. We do know that he contracted the plague as a younger man, and that he was, the plague resulted, and I'm not going to describe all the unpleasant symptoms, but one of them was that you had boils on your body, and we do know that he lanced those boils, so that he survived. Interestingly, his wife gave birth to the daughter just during the 1606-7 plague time, and because a servant in the house had died of the plague, and because another servant, when she went out, was thought to have had the plague. His neighbors, some of whom he had actually treated, brought the female servant back to the house, and although his wife had only just given birth, they actually boarded out the house, and they didn't allow them to get any provisions from the outside. So Foreman, the sick servant who turned out not to have the plague, and his wife and baby daughter were quarantined in the house and were forced to subsist, to survive on the meager provisions that they had. Mercifully, they all did survive, but you can see how that episode demonstrates that at moments of crisis of this sort, some of the worst instinct can come out in people.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this, and we wish you well for the rest of the period of social distancing, social isolation, quarantining. Very best.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to communicate with you during this time. Stay well, stay safe, and we hope you enjoyed this conversation about a rather dark topic.